Do you actually know what a filibuster is?
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Why would I ask that question? Well, my guest is here tonight to debunk some of the myths surrounding the filibuster and, you know, how the Congress and specifically the Senate run is really important to so many things that are going on right now. And we've had some changes, and we've had nuclear weapons and governmental ease and all of that. And I think the acumen for everyday Americans on civics, government, and all of that is at an all-time low. And so I think sometimes it's important to kind of seize the moment when we have smart people who can talk to us about it. Rich Arenberg is a political scientist from Brown University and hasn't been here for a while, but has been an often guest on the program. He's written a new book about it. I'm going to get his take on impeachment and the filibuster specifically. Of course, the big problem for the Democrats is that they pretty much know they have a roadblock for impeachment in the Senate. He is a Senate expert, and we'll refresh as to why. In the meantime, it is D-Day's 75th anniversary. Headline here, actually I thought the president's speech today was pretty much pitch perfect. Here's coverage from the network.
75 years later, the guns over Omaha Beach rang out in remembrance. On June 6, 1944, they were fired in hate. Thousands gathered at the American Cemetery in Normandy, France to honor the sacrifices made on that fateful day.
On this day, 75 years ago, 10,000 men shed their blood and thousands sacrificed their lives for their brothers, for their countries, and for the survival of liberty.
More than 150 D-Day veterans returned to the shores to be with their comrades, including 96-year-old vet Jake Larson, who says Omaha Beach today looks dramatically different.
The sea here is clear. It was bloody bodies. What can a person say now, except that war is hell?
Nous vous faisons chevalier.
French President Emmanuel Macron presented a number of U.S. veterans with the Legion of Honor, France's highest award.
We know what we owe to you veterans, our freedom. On behalf of my nation, I just want to say thank you.
The ceremony concluded with several flyby salutes. This will likely be the last time so many veterans will gather, so the 9,388 headstones stand as an eternal reminder of the sacrifice.
And so far, the tone remains what it should be. I mean, and so far, I haven't checked my phone yet, but the president hasn't upset what I thought was, you know, obviously a written speech for him, but he delivered it pretty well this morning. Welcome, Professor. Good to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be
You're not here
back.
to talk about that necessarily, or specifically impeachment, but I'm going to get your take on each of them because some of it dovetails into some of the Senate stuff.
Sure.
You ever a D-Day reflection at all?
Well, yeah, just, you know, here on the 75th anniversary, it's just probably one of the most important days in our history, and everything was on the line, and I think it's appropriate that we remind people of that, particularly people who were not alive at the time.
It is amazing to look at some of the really well done documentaries. HBO has one on E Company right now, part of the 101st Airborne. It is amazing the commonality of thought from these soldiers who experienced this day and days similar to it that don't get such notoriety.
Sure.
They all talk about not being heroes. They talk about the deceased and those who were lost being the heroes. They all have a commonality of trauma and experience that they've kept to themselves for the most part through their family lives for a long period of time. This greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw wrote about, I think is incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, I agree with that. What's so striking about that generation is the humility. And
Complete humility.
Yeah.
And internalization. The idea that which they experienced is really had to be pried out of them for the most part. And I think older age, most of these soldiers are now in the 90s who are able to make this visit. It's kind of like they've lost the stamina to not talk about it. But they've they're incredible, and their reunions are so special, and it's an interesting celebration.
Well, we've never in any war since,
heroism.
and we've had a number of them.
Right.
We've never had that circumstance in which everyone knew that essentially civilization as we knew it was on the line, and we don't get that level of involvement, not just the military but the whole society in modern day combat. I mean, when it leaves the front pages, I mean, here we are more than a decade in Afghanistan, and for most people who don't have a loved one in the military in Afghanistan,
Unaware.
it virtually doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's strange. Anyway, so so grateful for the heroism 75 years ago and beyond. A couple of headlines on the latest with the Democrats. Our guest is a political scientist and really expert on the Senate. The House is really conflicted over what to do with a dead end, most likely in the Senate, over this impeachment thing. Right. Here are a couple of headlines that really kind of reflect what's happening. Give me a little piece of this. We'll dig into it a little bit more, and then we'll talk about the filibuster, a word that is used and probably misunderstood or not even understood completely by the electorate. The House has a challenge. The Democrats have a real challenge.
Incredible challenge.
Talk to me about it.
Yeah, well, on the one hand, the Mueller report is really much clearer than most Americans realize. I mean, very few have actually read the 400-page report. It was terribly mischaracterized by the Attorney General, and then that was all we knew about it for another more than a month. Now that we're able to focus on what the report actually says, particularly the second volume, which was about obstruction of justice, pretty clearly makes it clear that Mueller believed that the president had obstructed justice, but that he was not in a position. There's a lot to say about that too, by the way, but he was not in a position to indict him because of a memo in the Department of Justice saying that presidents couldn't be indicted.
And we have conflict still between Attorney General Barr and Special Counsel Mueller over whether this policy of not indicting a sitting president ruled the day in this investigation. Their comments are either conflicting or beating around each other's bush, right? And so it's really hard to get a handle as to whether there's a clear discrepancy between the two of them. It seems to me there is.
Yeah.
But Mueller is just so close to the vest, disciplined, and sees his limited role, I think, pretty actualized, right? That he doesn't want to stir this pot.
Right. I think he will testify, however.
You do?
I do.
All right, when we come back, we'll talk about that, because that's interesting. And then we'll talk about the term filibuster. So get out your notes. Be right back.
I rise today, Mr. Speaker, to call for the impeachment of the President of the United States of America for obstruction of justice.
That's old.
Yes.
That's you know, Representative Green's been doing that since he
Yeah,
got
he
in.
was standing almost alone when he was doing that.
And now,
Yeah.
and now there's a bubbling up of squeaky wheels on the House side, including our own Democratic First District Congressman David Cicilline, who heads up the communications for Congress. And today, in fact, he told local news reporters that he is in complete disagreement with Nancy Pelosi over how to proceed here. He wants an impeachment inquiry, which he says does not guarantee a vote on impeachment. I don't know. Okay. But you think Bob Mueller will testify?
I do think he'll testify.
Behind closed doors or publicly?
I think publicly. He's made it clear that that's not his preference. But I think he may very well do so voluntarily under pressure from the committee. But
without subpoena.
But failing that, they're going to issue a subpoena, and it's just, I think given who Bob Mueller is, I think it's very unlikely that he would refuse to answer a subpoena.
And he kind of hinted in his presentation, his exclusive presentation, that although he was hoping this was the end of it for him, that if he was called, he would be staying between the lines of the report. Well, the lines of the report aren't this wide. They're this wide.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
That's right.
So...
And as we've already seen...
He may just be reading, well, on page 372, let me tell you what we said, right? And there'll be a much different dynamic,
right,
I think, with the verbalization of that.
Yeah. Well, going back to what I said before, most people have no idea. You know, probably half the country believes the president when he says he was exonerated by it. So, and most of the country really has no idea of just how the detailed accusations that are there. And I think it's pretty clear that what the special counsel was intending to do was make this an impeachment referral to the House of Representatives, that it was really their decision to make. Maybe, I should say referral, maybe not impeachment referral. It's up to them whether or not they look at that evidence and then say, well, we need to go forward.
It seems to me that time is ticking away on the space that they have to get this done. Do you agree?
I do. I agree. I think the closer you get to the 2020 election, the less likely it becomes that an actual impeachment will be triggered.
So it has to be wrapped up by the end of 2019, don't you think?
Well, wrapped up at least the course of action at that point needs to be clear. In other words, if they're into an inquiry, if there are in fact specific articles of impeachment that the House is then going to vote on and then send it to the Senate, I think at that point, if it goes into 2020, then just so be it.
I don't know that if they have an impeachment inquiry, they can't not have a vote.
I think that's right.
So an inquiry means a vote, which means sending it to the Senate, which means that's where it stops.
I have to be honest, I'm very conflicted about this myself.
You are a Senate expert.
Yeah.
How long did you work in the Senate?
34 years.
34 years. Yeah. For how many senators?
3. All Democrats.
Right.
And I'm very conflicted about the decision. I mean, I for a very long time, really since the beginning of the investigation, you know, and I've said this to my students, so you know that a partisan impeachment, an impeachment that's carried out by one party against the president of the other party, is a mistake, and that because it's hard for the American people to see that as legitimate, and I believe that, but the current circumstance has pushed me further and further in the direction of feeling that an impeachment is required, is inevitable in this circumstance.
Again, we got to remember, impeachment's the indictment, conviction's what sends them packing. Which are you talking about here?
I'm talking about the action by the House.
Okay.
Now, you know, if the House impeaches, the Senate's going to hold a trial. I think it's profoundly disappointing that we all, people in the media, people in academia, people in politics, all observers of our national politics, everyone says, well, it's going to die in the Senate. The Senate won't convict. Well, the Senate in an impeachment circumstance is the court. It's the trial. It's the jury. And if we said that about any other court in America before evidence has been presented, before the indictment's even been written, before any evidence has been brought to the trial court, we would be scandalized by the fact that if we could say, well, there's no way that any jury would convict.
Are you suggesting that there's Republican flips impossible? I want to get to the filibuster conversation, but this is intriguing to me.
Yeah, well...
You really think that based on the evidence, the verbal testimony,
no, I don't,
the to and fro, that
no, I tend to think that if there's a trial in the Senate, the president will be acquitted. I've become convinced of that. Now, you know...
So why do it? Because it's the right thing to do?
Sometimes, at some point, the Constitution has to be defended.
And do you believe this concept that, well, Bill Clinton was impeached, but not then, look what happened, he roared to re-election. Is it the same circumstance?
No, it's not the same circumstance, and when you really go back and examine that election, so it's not all that clear. I mean, it probably didn't help the Republicans to have impeached Clinton, but I don't think that the lesson is so clear that, and I'm not sure that kind of political judgment is appropriate in this circumstance.
All right, well, time will tell. In the meantime, when we come back, how the Senate behaves and some of its key rules, including this tool known as the filibuster. Stay with us. 5 myths about the filibuster. Define it, Professor. Define filibuster.
Well, the filibuster is a label that's applied to any number of efforts that can be made in the Senate to prevent a vote taking place on an issue that's come before the Senate. And this is pursuant to one of the foundations, one of the main foundations under the institution of the Senate as we know it, and that is unlimited debate. Now, there is a procedure that's called cloture that's in the rules that requires 60 votes, and that's the association we have between that 60 vote supermajority.
And cloture, if there's 60 votes for cloture, it means you wrap it up.
That's right. Debate then ends. There can be 30 additional hours of debate, and then you vote.
That's it.
That's right. And that plays a very important role historically in the Senate. It isn't so much just it's often thought of as just obstruction of the majority, but it's played the role of giving the minority in the Senate a voice historically. It's given them some leverage.
Which is not something that either party wants to do anymore for the other, it seems. The dignity of the Senate that's kind of built into the Constitution by its almost intrinsic nature has been washed down, hasn't it?
Yes.
You look pained when I ask you that question. I think you have a love of that chamber.
I really do. I love that institution, and I think it's had its horrible moments in American history, and it hasn't always done the right thing, but I think it has served the nation particularly well. And I think it's historically almost always been the cradle of compromise.
Gotcha. So we've actually, they have changed the rules on X number of things that require 60 votes.
We have this thing called the nuclear option.
Right, which is now, 51 votes gets you a U.S. Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, that's right. And which I, in my first book, Defending the Filibuster, I argued against doing that very strongly. And it was really the Democrats that fired the first shot. they eliminated the filibuster on judicial nominations below the level of the Supreme Court. And then the Republicans, when they took control and had a Republican in the White House, as we know, they eliminated the filibuster on Supreme Court nominations.
So the filibuster, which is designed for kind of the tool of unending debate, by its nature is eliminated when the votes move from 60 minimum to 51 minimum.
Well, yeah,
you can
because
you can still. So we don't have a cloture vote at 51. We only have a cloture vote.
We do have a cloture.
We
What
do.
they've done.
It's a variation.
You know, this gets you into the weeds a little bit, but what they've done is they haven't changed the roles, but through a procedural sleight of hand, the circumstance in the Senate now is on a judicial nomination or an executive branch nomination. The Rule 22, which says 3/5 of the Senate, is interpreted as meaning a simple majority. You know, what I always like to say to my classes is you don't have to be a math major, an English major, or a math whiz to know that's simply absurd.
Yeah, you put that, and if those students of yours put that number down in the same way in their math class, they will be failing the class.
Exactly.
The myths, we only have a couple of minutes here. The myths, the filibuster is unconstitutional. It's a long-winded speech, necessarily. Ending the filibuster would end gridlock. It goes on. What is the biggest myth? I mean, this, by the way, the professor's got a new book out. It's called Congressional Procedure, and you can get it where?
Everywhere.
Everywhere. You know, do these books get widely read?
Yeah.
It'd be worth everybody's time.
Yes, it's not going to be on the New York Times bestsellers list, but
It feels very academic.
It is, but it's written
Easily?
My intent in writing it was to open up the black box. Most people see Congress as a black box, and I wanted to make it accurate but accessible.
All right. So give me 30 seconds on what what the big misunderstanding is and what people should know about it, real quick.
Well, the biggest thing, I think the most important thing is this notion of the nuclear option. As I said, it's a procedural ploy that I believe, in my view, is illegitimate for the reasons I hinted at before, but it has profound implications. I mean, we saw in the Kavanaugh hearings, if the filibuster had been there, even if they hadn't been intent on blocking the nomination entirely, they would have said, remember when he refused to turn over hundreds of thousands of documents, the Democrats would have said, no documents, no confirmation.
The read is a good one. You need to stay informed, and if you're more intrigued, then I hope you are, about the Senate and how it operates, check it out. Professor, great to see you. Thanks, appreciate it. Final word and we come back. I'll tell you something, this book, Congressional Procedure, may feel a little texty to you, but it's easy to use, and if you've got a question or debate going on amidst your peers, your family, whatever, on what's happening in the news when it comes to Congress, you can simply go to this and say, it's either right, wrong, or changing. Dyslexia, real problem with our kids. Tomorrow's show. We'll talk to you on the radio at 3 until 6 on WPRO. Bye.